Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Catholicism. I'm here with Ethan Muse, and today we're looking at a clip from a much longer debate that Alex O'Connor and Trent Horn participated in on the resurrection of Jesus. But there's a particular clip that Alex O'Connor put on his channel where they were talking about Marian apparitions, and we get Alex's, official, unofficial response to Marian apparitions. That's what we're going through today, and I've brought Ethan Muse, who's done a lot of work on Marian apparitions, but some of the other topics that they get into also happen to align with some recent work that Ethan has done on Mormonism. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of fun. Ethan, was there anything from this clip that you wanted to highlight before we just start playing it and get in interacting with it?
No, I mean, just the thing that was interesting was that Trent brings up these supernatural apparitions as evidence of Christianity that basically corroborate the resurrection, because they only really make sense given that Christianity is true. And so he's putting those forward as an argument or as a sort of indirect proof of the resurrection from these other very well attested, supernatural events like Fatima and Zeitoun are the two examples that he mentions explicitly. And then Alex's response really isn't a response to the question that's posed to him. He says, well, look, there's claims about supernatural events in other religious traditions, and then here's an example, right? Now notice, that wouldn't, we could concede that. We could even concede that these were, naturalistically inexplicable events that happened in the context of Mormonism, which is the one that he gets into. And that wouldn't do anything to address the question of, what is the explanation for these supernatural events given Alex's worldview. So presumably Alex is not a supernaturalist, so he's going to give a debunking explanation of both the Mormon case and of these Marian apparitions. But if that were so, why would we think the same debunking would work for the Marian apparitions and the Mormon case? Because the nature of the evidence is very different, and the nature of the claims is very different between those cases. So it's not clear why this is responsive to the question or what work he's done to actually explain it. Now, meanwhile, also, on the Catholic side, you could concede that there was something supernatural that occurred in the Mormon context and just give a different explanation for it. So either show how it's consistent with Catholicism that God works this sign, or just say, hey, it's preternatural, it's like a demon has worked this sign. We know that it's already a commitment of the Catholic worldview that demons sometimes do prodigious stuff to deceive people. So it's easy to accommodate it within our worldview. So it's not clear to me. Now, I don't think there is any credibility to the examples that he brings up from within the Mormon tradition. So I don't think they're remotely comparable to the Catholic cases. But it's not clear to me why the logic of the response works. It's not answering the question.
Yeah, that was my impression too. I mean, I've listened back to this clip a couple times, and it just struck me. I was even sometimes I'll put different responses into AI and be like, hey, what do you think about this? Just to see what it says. And it completely missed this point. It completely missed the fact that he's basically kind of shifting the goalpost, comparing these Mormon claims about evidence of their religion to the resurrection when the question was about Marian apparitions. And it was just strange that AI just completely missed that. I do wonder if there's some kind of motivation on the part of some of these AIs to be really Mormon friendly. And that kind of brings up another point, that there's a lot of reason for atheists to latch onto these claims from within Mormonism, because they can say okay, look, you agree, most people agree that Mormonism is pretty silly, but if I can show that these are similar, like your claims and their claims are similar, then they're just both equally silly. And so there's reason for atheists to latch onto these claims from Mormons. But that's what I want to do today is actually dig into some of the material that Alex brings up. So let's go ahead and turn to our first clip, which is basically just Trent laying out the question, and then we're going to get into Alex's response. And we're going to be pausing along the way and just offering commentary, but the entire clip, I think, is about 11 minutes, so we'll get through it in the course of the stream. Let's start with our first clip where Trent is laying out his question.
I've noticed, in the past 10 years, I've studied a lot between, two groups that often debate this. You'll have skeptics on one side, like Alex, or previously debates, like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. And then you have a lot of evangelical apologists, people like William Lane Craig and Mike Licona. And one thing I've noticed that they both kind of have in common is they're very skeptical towards non-Protestant supernatural things. So what will happen in these situations, I've seen Bart Ehrman, I've seen others say, well, why don't you believe in these, groups of people say that they saw the Virgin Mary at Fatima or the Virgin Mary at Zeitoun, Egypt. And we even have photographs of this apparition that has appeared, that hundreds of thousands of people saw this illuminated figure at Zeitoun. Travis Doomsday did a whole academic book that recently on the Zeitoun apparition, and he finds it inexplicable. Dale Allison, who I know you spoke with recently, Alex,
yes,
he finds it just inexplicable because even the Egyptian authorities shut off the electricity to the area, and yet this illuminated figure that looks a lot like the Virgin Mary still appeared. So for me,
by the way, it's Travis Doomsday, not Doomsday. Some people are making that mistake, and this is not a knock on. Yeah, it's not a knock on Trent or anything.
If it was Doomsday.
It's Doomsday. Those are the basic facts about Zeitoun. I've covered Zeitoun on the main Capturing Christianity channel, so you can go check out those videos if you want some more details. I've even argued that there's better evidence for Christianity from events like Zeitoun than for Christianity from like the resurrection accounts. I've argued that just because the amount of evidence that we have for those events is closer to the events, it's more numerous, and so it's I think a very good case can be made that the sort of later evidence that we have from Zeitoun, from Fatima, are better evidence than the resurrection, which doesn't mean that the resurrection isn't more important. I think that's where people get hung up a lot, is where they think, well, the resurrection is like the foundational event of Christianity, so therefore it's the most important, so therefore it has to have better evidence. It doesn't work like that. You can have different degrees of evidence for different claims, even if one is sort of later and less important than the sort of central founding miracle of Christianity. It doesn't entail that the evidence is going to be better one way or the other. But Zeitoun is...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
There is an asymmetry in evidence for the resurrection in that all of these Marian apparitions, as Trent points out, are evidence for the resurrection, right? So you're just talking about the primary evidence where it's like direct eyewitness testimony for the resurrection, but there are other ways to confirm the resurrection. So for instance, at the end of the Gospel of Mark, we're told that God is going to work signs through the apostles to confirm his word by the signs that accompanied it, right? So he's going to perform all the miracles that the apostles are doing throughout the apostolic age is meant to be further evidence of the Christian message. And so clearly miracles, insofar as they continue to be performed in connection with Christianity, until the consummation of the world, are all evidence for the resurrection, which is the central claim of Christianity. So I wouldn't even view it as a strict dichotomy. So you can say, hey, just based on having ancient historical documents, there are different ways that skeptics could approach dealing with that type of evidence, that kind of evidence. But one way that God keeps renewing the evidence for the resurrection is by performing vindicatory miracles that are adapted to each age. And so he keeps renewing the evidence through new signs.
Yeah, that's a good point. What typically happens, though, is that Protestants, as Trent mentioned, they'll be skeptical of these types of miracles because they involve Mary, they involve these sort of Marian apparitions or visions or whatever. And so, how do we account for those within a Protestant worldview? And so that's why they'll be a little bit more skeptical. But we're sitting here being like, this is good evidence for the truth of Christianity more broadly, right? So we should embrace this evidence with open arms. And yeah, it's really bizarre because the evidence for these apparitions is just so good. It's so good. And unfortunately, Alex doesn't even really respond to it, or he just sort of pivots to Mormonism. But the evidence is just so remarkably good. For the case of Zeitoun, we'll spend just a minute here or so. In the case of Zeitoun, I think they started in 1968 in a suburb of Cairo named Zeitoun. And it happened over a Coptic Orthodox church. The first person to see this apparition was actually a Muslim. He had I think it was his thumb or his finger. Maybe you can actually remind me, Ethan. But he had it like his hand was healed after he pointed at the apparition just a couple days later. And this happened over the course of 3 years. There was numerous, I don't know exactly the exact number. There's estimates of how many apparitions actually occurred, but they were eventually drawing in so many crowds that the Egyptian government had to start cutting down trees so that people could go and actually witness like what was going on here. Trent mentioned that they shut down the power. That's true. They shut down the power to the area just to like rule out any kind of, natural hoax that was happening and stuff like that. Like there's really no good natural explanation for this event. And in the case of Mormonism, we'll talk about it in a little bit, and Ethan will share his thoughts on all that. But there really is no good natural explanation for the apparitions at Zeitoun. Sometimes there was doves flying ahead. They would form the shape of a cross above or behind the apparition. The apparition is also associated with like sight and smell. So there was clouds of like incense, that red incense that would like billow up above the church, which was also inexplicable and reported by, thousands of people. You can go read the eyewitness reports that are still available now. So this is a very serious Marian apparition that occurred in recent times that is very well documented, and it poses a really genuine challenge to people like Alex. And so that's why I was so excited. Like I wanted to hear what Alex was going to say. And his response was just super underwhelming. And you'll see why in just a minute. But Ethan, anything else on that before we move forward?
No, yeah. I mean, with cases like Zeitoun, first, we're talking about hostile witnesses, indifferent witnesses. We're talking about this being a repetitious phenomena that's spaced out over years, right? Where it's recurring at the same location. There's spatially dispersed witnesses that are all giving convergent details about what they're seeing at the same place. And there's lots of medically verified healings over this entire window that are connected with these apparitions. There's some doubt about the photographic evidence, because at least some of the photographic evidence can be shown to be digitally manipulated. But there's interesting questions about several, though, of these photographs that have been circulated.
Can I talk about that a little bit? So yeah. the actual photographs themselves, some people have been skeptical about this because it's like in 1968, photographs were obviously a thing. They were developed in the late 1800s, and so photography was developed in the late 1800s. And so you might think, oh, this is like we should have a lot more photographs of the apparition than we actually do have. I want to push back on that because back in those times, there was only film that was available. And then to actually get a picture of like a nighttime scene, which was what was going on. That was when you could actually see the apparition lighting up above the church. You had to basically be a professional photographer in those times to be able to capture what was happening above that church because it was low light conditions. So in low light conditions, even today, I guess modern technology has made it a lot easier, especially on your phone and stuff, to capture a photo in a low light condition. So if it's really dark in your room, you can still capture something good. Sometimes you'll have to like hold your phone for a while for it to like capture everything that's going on there. It's just because it's a low light situation. So that was those were the conditions that were happening at Zeitoun. So they needed to have like basically a tripod. They needed to shoot with black and white film because that was the only type of film that could really shoot at night. That's why they're in black and white, even though color was available back then, so far as I know. So you had to be like that's my main point, is that you had to be like a professional in order to capture these things. And that's why the photos that do exist are from professional photographers that existed in those days.
When it doesn't need to show up on camera, the supernatural manifestations don't have to play by the same rules, right? And so even if it is subjective, or even if it is in some way concealed where you couldn't take a photograph of it, basically the fact that a whole bunch of spatially dispersed people are seeing the same things, even though they're not coordinating their experiences with each other at the same place, if there's no physical stimulus that's coordinating their experiences, that's a miracle, right?
Yeah.
So even if it didn't show up on camera. Now, there's debate about whether there is credible photographic evidence, because a lot of the photographs that are circulating online, the provenance is questionable. There was a physicist that had worked on the shroud that looked at some of the collections of photographs, and he determined that for at least some of these photographs, there was evidence that they had been altered. But there are some photographs out there that are more credible. But yeah, so the photographic record is interesting. The photographic evidence for another apparition they talk about, Fatima, actually is much more compelling to me because the provenance of the photographs is completely uncontested, and the way that the photographs corroborate the witness testimony is indirect rather than direct. So and that's what's really interesting with this Rua series that corroborates the miracle of the sun at Fatima.
All right, let's continue listening to how Trent sets up this question.
So for me, I take more middle ground saying, yeah, I think that was a supernatural event. And also, I think these other events like Fatima or Zeitoun, for me, they lend evidence to Jesus' resurrection, because if Jesus did rise from the dead, these appearances of his mother would not be unexpected. I'd expect a son to take care of his mom, take her up to heaven, and she might go talk to the faithful. But if Jesus did not rise from the dead, these sorts of apparitions and appearances would be very unexpected. So I'm open more so that there's many strange and odd things that happen. Some of them can be explained naturally, but many I don't think can. So I think that we should follow evidence. We shouldn't necessarily rush to supernatural explanations, but we should see which explanation best accounts for everything without cramming the evidence, without bringing in outside ad hoc explanations. And I think Jesus rising from the dead really does do a good job of explaining a lot of the data surrounding Jesus' resurrection, but also these other supernatural events throughout history that are connected to the Christian faith. So that's kind of...
So I just want to, so he was basically saying, you know, we've got these modern supernatural occurrences, events that seem to coincide with the resurrection and support it. And he even gave like an argument to sort of bolster the prior probability that Jesus would want to take care of his mom and stuff, which is actually, I think, a really good point that he made. But the thing I want you to focus on is the way that the host interprets his question and poses it back to Alex. Okay. And then listen to Alex's response.
It's kind of how I look at it.
Alex, I was recently hosting your tour across the UK, an evening with Alex O'Connor, and so many people wanted to find out about what you thought about apparitions. I don't know if that's something you've looked into a lot, or what do you make of this kind of additional case for the resurrection?
Well, it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah. So again, he focuses on the Marian apparitions, and that's like the specific question that he wants to know about from Alex. And that was also obviously what Trent was asking about too. But it's important to know what question was asked to him, because it's going to inform the way that we respond to Alex's response to that question. Anything else to add, Ethan?
No, let's go. Let's keep going.
Cool.
Isn't it? Because a lot of the time when arguing with a Protestant, you can say something like, well, then how do you explain the Marian apparitions? And with a Catholic, that doesn't quite fly. I suppose I have a general suspicion of these kinds of religious events. And that's not to say that they didn't happen, but to say that insofar as concerns my faith in the resurrected Jesus, they don't do very much. And I can tell you why. It's because I don't think that such experiences are unique to the Christian tradition.
Let's pause there. So he says he doesn't think that they're unique to the Christian tradition, and what he's about to do is pivot to Mormonism. Any thoughts on this so far?
Well, so first, whether they're unique to the Christian tradition or not, if supernatural events occur, right? So if there is credible evidence of events that exceed the power of nature that occur in religious contexts, obviously, first, that's going to refute Alex's sort of skeptical naturalist worldview. And second, what it's going to do is just dramatically raise the prior that any particular supernatural claim is true. So it may change how he interprets the implications of Jesus rising from the dead. You know, if he thinks God is doing supernatural events, or if he thinks that there are powerful spirits going around performing all these miracles all the time in all these different religious contexts, it may mean that he doesn't infer from the resurrection that Christianity is true, but it clearly is relevant to the probability that this supernatural claim is true, that supernatural events occur all the time rather than none of the time. So he needs more than just that it's not unique to Christianity. If either he's saying that all of the claims can be debunked, in which case he would need to show that the evidence for the Marian apparitions were as bad as the other cases where he thinks he can debunk it, right? Or he thinks, no, there's credible evidence that they do occur across all these contexts, in which case that's really bad news for his perspective. So regardless of whether he's right, now I've given my explanation elsewhere where I do think miracles happen in a whole bunch of religious contexts because God answers prayers and because demons exist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So like you can have apparent miracles that are counterfeits done by demons. You can have God answering prayers and healing people or performing signs. I think vindicatory miracles, so miracles that are performed, public, extraordinary signs that are meant to point people towards doctrinal content and to promulgate that doctrinal content, I think either they affirm Catholic distinctives and they are pointing people to Catholicism, or they're just consistent with Catholicism. So they only affirm things that are in conformity with Catholic teaching, but never point people away from Catholicism or towards false sects. Like, for instance, if we just take Zeitoun as an example, even if it's occurring in a Coptic Orthodox context, there's no seer, so there's no private revelations that are being vindicated by these appearances. So all it is Our Lady appearing over a Coptic Orthodox church, which is perfectly consistent with Catholic doctrine. And in fact, that's one of the ways that, God works to impel people towards Christian unity, according to the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, is miracles are a way that he accomplishes that, right? But meanwhile, if you're taking a case like Fatima, then the seers are actually being given messages where they're being told things like, it's really important to God that there be a, devotion in the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and that the Pope, who she refers to as the Holy Father, consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and all these rewards are going to be contingent upon that, and saying that she's agreeing to convert people to the Catholic faith, and that she's performing this extraordinary sign prophesied 3 months in advance on October 13th of 1917, precisely with the intent so that all may believe, after she's already granted these petitions to convert people to Catholicism. So we look and we say, look, the vindicatory content of the Fatima message is very specific and exclusive to Catholicism. And then we look at Zeitoun and we see all the elements of it are consistent with Catholicism. There's nothing that contradicts it. And so basically that way we look at the overall miracle record and we see that even if there are prodigious phenomena that occur across a range of contexts, the spectacular public extraordinary signs that have specific doctrinal content are privileging in a unique way the Catholic faith.
By the way, that is actually Travis Doomsday. That's his take on this as well. With respect to Zeitoun, I think he's actually Orthodox, but he thinks that it's an ecumenical event or supernatural sign in part because it doesn't. She never spoke to anybody. She never said anything. So that's under the situation in which someone is speaking and giving content to the seer. That is when you might think that there's some sort of inference that you can draw from that content to the truth of some doctrine or the truth of some religion, right? But in that case, she never spoke to anybody, which was pretty interesting. It's actually really interesting that in the course of Zeitoun, there was never any speaking. So, yeah, interesting. Fatima obviously was a lot different. So I just wanted to highlight that, though.
And if you look at it, it actually is the exception that proves the rule. So the most credible Marian apparition, the grandest Marian apparition that occurs in a non-Catholic context, doesn't have private revelation. Now, contrast that with all the major Catholic Marian apparitions that are very well documented, right? And so you're looking at Fatima, you're looking at Lourdes, you're looking at Guadalupe, right? And we could keep going. We could keep enumerating a long list of apparitions that had accompanying public signs and therefore had a vindicatory intent. And in all those cases, Our Lady is choosing a seer and giving a message to them. But the time that she decides to do this ecumenical miracle, that's when she doesn't choose a seer, doesn't give them a message, which is showing there's something special about the Catholic Church because Our Lady talks to us and she doesn't even talk to the other sects.
Good point. All right, let's go through some super chats. I did want to mention earlier on that we will be taking super chats today. Any Protestant that sides with Alex on this only prove they're atheists with Bibles. Change my mind. Yeah, I think this is a very common line that like Trent Horn will use, that Protestants argue like atheists a lot and stuff. And I think there's probably some truth to that. There's some truth to that they will put on their skeptical hat, and really what's happening is that they're being inconsistent in their skepticism, which I think is a problem for a lot of people, not just Protestants. It can happen to Catholics. It can happen to everybody if you're applying your skepticism in a sort of lazy way that makes it like you're favoring something over something else for no good reason. And that's kind of what's happening here, because the Zeitoun apparition, the Fatima, and stuff like these are very well evidenced events. And so you should accept it, especially if you accept the resurrection on the account of what we have in the Gospels, what we have in Paul's letters. So if you accept it on that, if you accept the resurrection on that basis, then you should also accept that the really good evidence for these other apparitions. And what often happens, from our position, is that people are applying their skepticism inconsistently. If you applied the same level of skepticism, if you're skeptical of Zeitoun, if you applied that same level of skepticism to the resurrection, then you would just not be a Christian. You would just doubt that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And so that's ultimately, I think, the point that Trent is making, that I would also affirm. It does seem to be inconsistent.
Oh, well, yeah.
Any other thoughts on that?
About it. Yeah, think about it. It's just, at the very least, what the person is doing, because a person who adopts this hyper-skepticism towards Catholic miracle claims, maybe they have these very personal reasons that they accept Christian truth claims, even though they reject the Catholic truth claims. But what they've completely forsaken is any ability to do apologetics for Christianity, or to go out and defend the Christian faith against a skeptic. Because if you're going and you're saying, look, you could have photographs, you could have scientific analyses for these Eucharistic miracles, you could have, 100,000 witnesses and all of them have signed their names and it's contemporaneous documentation, you could have 15,000 healings, and, you could have people's eyes regenerating through the intercession of all these saints and all this stuff, and you're going to still strain for skeptical, atheistic explanations of all of this stuff, to then go back to the person and then say, oh, well, based off of these ancient historical documents, where there's debates about the provenance of the documents and who's writing the documents and how much legendary embellishment has occurred in these documents, you're going to say that evidentiary record should persuade the atheist, even though they have in the background that, even in cases where they had way more overwhelming evidence presented to them, that basically there was always a skeptical naturalistic debunking of it. It puts you in a dialectically impossible situation to advance the resurrection. So he will always have a trump card if you're debating him, and yet you play the skeptic against Catholics. So you've just completely neutralized your ability to do apologetics for Christianity.
It's a big problem. I think you highlighted a really good reason why it's such a big problem for people, and why everyone should just embrace Rome. Just do it. Just embrace. Ethan, why wouldn't Mary or God make the earlier non-solar Marian apparitions at Fatima be fully visible and audible to everyone?
Well, so again, one thing we all have to keep in mind is that God chooses to remain epistemically distant from humanity. So during this period of human history, God has decided that there's only a partial tear in the veil that separates God, separates heaven and earth. And so he wants, just as he has throughout history, he wants to have a relationship with humanity, but he also wants there to be plausible deniability, where people, if they choose to reject a relationship with him, can ignore the evidence, right? And can always manufacture reasons to continue to doubt or just to refuse to pay attention to it. And so, and everybody, no matter what type of Christian that you are, you have to believe that, right? Someone could pose exactly the same question regarding the resurrection, which is why did Jesus have to ascend? Why couldn't Jesus just hang around? Why couldn't Jesus have made it to where there was video of him during the ascension and he left that behind? Or he left a VHS tape behind with the apostles? Why doesn't Jesus keep making public appearances in front of 100 million? So notice this question is actually a very generic theological question and not something that has anything in particular to do with Fatima. So, which is just when God chooses to reveal himself and to dramatically vindicate something, he does so in a way that provides evidence that is clear, that is rationally compelling, but that also leaves behind and preserves the psychological possibility of doubt, right? So he'll give you credible evidence, but he'll make it psychologically possible for people to doubt. And so the people who are of goodwill, who seek after the truth and want to adhere to it, they have enough there where if they seek, they will find. But it's not coercive to such an extent that if a person chooses to obstinately reject it, they can't tell themselves a story that has some level of psychological plausibility to it, right? Or that makes it possible for them not to attend to it. So that's why God circumscribes, he puts certain limits on how plainly he reveals himself. And some of this is just gratuitous, right? So we're not entitled to these extraordinary signs. And it's God's liberality that dictates the extent to which he chooses to reveal himself plainly to particular people at particular times, right? So obviously the evidence that the apostles received is better than the evidence that anybody else is going to receive, right? But so there is a certain level of, it's like a gratuitous gift that God gives to certain people. But there's another element of it, which is that during this period of time, when he wants there to be progressive revelation, when he wants us all to have to work together to spread the kingdom of God on earth, while he wants us still to have to basically elicit acts of faith that are virtuous, there's a certain level of hiddenness that he needs to maintain. And so that's what he's balancing. Basically, rationally compelling evidence for people who honestly and earnestly inquire versus for those who obstinately reject, preserving the psychological possibility of doubt.
I think that was a really good, like, direct answer to his question, but I wanted to highlight something from your article, which I want to point everyone to his article on Fatima. He's got a couple on his Substack. You can go follow Ethan on his Substack. But what I wanted to point out is that one thing that you made mention of in your article that really blew me away and really made me appreciate the nature of the apparitions and the fact that they were only visible to these 3 shepherd children and not visible to everyone else. What level of technology, what level of like know-how would you have to have in order to make that possible, to make something visible only to this, perceptible to only to this small group and imperceptible to everyone else? How do you actually do that? So it's almost harder to explain.
Oh no, and I also want to mention to people, I'm answering the question of principle in the super chat, but I think another thing that's important to mention is that there is external corroboration that something supernatural was going on from the crowds that had gathered to witness it before October the 13th. So for instance, you're getting conversions that are happening, like supernatural conversions that are happening. You're getting healings that are happening in these crowds. You're getting people that are witnessing prodigies, right? So solar prodigies that are very subjective experiences. You have lots of reports of that from previous apparitions before October the 13th. You're having one of the most commonly reported things is exactly coinciding with like the start and the end of the apparitions. There's a cloud of smoke that's forming above the home oak where Our Lady is supposedly appearing. And it never appears at any other time when people go to this place, So long after, long before, during the apparitions throughout this, the only time it seems, and there's no censor, people went and investigated it. So you look into that, the day the children are abducted and they're not allowed to go to the cova on October 13th because a local administrator has detained them. Well, the crowd still gathers there in expectation of the children coming and of this supernatural event occurring. And then Our Lady, basically to show that she's keeping her end of the bargain, right? Even though the children have been impeded from coming. And so therefore to provide further corroboration, as well as to express her dissatisfaction with what has occurred, there's a huge explosion that's heard that causes the crowd to disperse in a panic right at the time the apparitions were scheduled for, and this is amply corroborated by testimony. So it's not just purely, so even though the apparitions are only seen by the children all the way up until basically October the 13th, there's lots and lots of external corroboration by these crowds of witnesses that are gathering that lots of prodigious phenomena are happening in connection with the apparitions as well.
Yeah, I did want you to comment on what I was talking about as well, which was, yes, we have these external corroborations, but also the fact that, like, how do you what type of technology would you have to have back in 1917 to be able to produce this visual experience for this small group of people that was imperceptible to everyone else? Like,
given that if you're a skeptic, you're going to give a psychological explanation for the experiences as children. I don't think you're going to be able to maintain a conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm also assuming at this point that you've already ruled out the sort of natural explanations for the apparitions for the children. And that at that point, like, if you do rule those out, then you have to start thinking, like, what type of agent was able to produce this in just the small select group? It have to be
clear. If you concede that there isn't a psychological explanation for the credible testimony of these children, then it's supernatural. It's naturalistically inexplicable. I think that's very direct. Now, I've gone into in my articles and in various appearances why I don't think there is a psychological explanation that can be given for these children's testimony. And so we can demonstrate very much that they were sincere, that they were lucid, that these were conforming with perfect reliability with 3 people to a pre-announced schedule. There are like undesigned coincidences between their reports that indicate that there's shared content between them. They were of the age where they could reliably discriminate between perception and imagination. Their experiences were very perceptually grounded, where they're like being blinded, and having to divert their gaze from this like external locus where Our Lady is supposed to have been appearing, So when we look into it and we really dig into and examine, we can rule out all the psychological mechanisms of they're lying, they're deluded, they're having hallucinations. And so there's a lot more that can be said in this regard. But yeah, I do think we can positively exclude all the psychological explanations. And then really all that remains is a supernatural explanation.
Yep. And then what follows after that is Catholicism. You know what? This is actually really important, like that we're laying this groundwork through these super chats. We're about to return to Alex's response. But I think it's important to lay some of this groundwork now, because when you hear the way that he sort of pivots and goes to Mormonism, like there just is no comparison that you can make between Fatima and, say, the Transfiguration of Brigham Young. Like it's remarkable that he thinks that these are...
We're going to get into that, and it's like the Transfiguration of Brigham Young is not a credible historical event. Okay.
Hold on before you go into all that. Let's actually play that clip. Let's get to that. There are some more super chats that came in, but we'll return to those in a bit. Let's get back to Alex.
Although sort of the experience of a bodily risen Christ by multiple people all at once is definitely something that would be unique in history. You don't get group hallucinations of that kind of physical kind. There are a few things I want to say. Firstly, you do have inexplicable group visions of, I think, equally inexplicable events, which I'll give you some examples of. And secondly...
So he says equally inexplicable events, and he's about to pivot to Mormonism.
It's insane when you learn the facts. It's insane to say
I'm actually not quite sure of the nature of the resurrected Jesus as reported in the Gospels. There seems to be at least a bit of a back and forth amongst the Gospel authors and within Paul's letters as to the physicality of Jesus' resurrection, leading some scholars to posit things such as trans-physicality and this kind of stuff to explain why at some points it seems like Jesus is this ghostly figure who tells people not to touch him and can move through walls, and how Paul says that flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom, and all of this kind of stuff. And 2 Peter talking about how he has this tent of a body that he will one day get rid of, as we've seen Christ essentially do.
Pause real quick?
But at the
So let's just also point out how we're like politician level pivoting right now. There's something that we've come prepared to discuss, which is like the nature of the Christ, physical body after he's resurrected, and what the basically gospel authors and what St. Paul is saying about those. He's come prepared and he has talking points on those, even though they have no relevance to the question that's been posed regarding Marian apparitions in modern times, right? And so that's the question. Marian apparitions in modern times provide evidence for the resurrection. And now, for some reason, we're talking about trans-physicality of Jesus' resurrected body. What's the logical connection?
Yeah, well, I mean, to try to be as fair as possible. So this was a broader conversation about the resurrection. So I think he's attempting to like consistently bring it back to that topic, but in context, right, they're talking about these Marian apparitions. So to me, that would be where he needs to focus his attention and not get sidetracked with throwing out all these, I want to call them red herrings. They're not necessarily red herrings because they are still technically on the general topic. But yeah, I do wish he would have just addressed it specifically.
Topic. Yeah, you don't just talk about the general topic. You talk about the question that's on the table to be discussed. That's how you can. So if somebody comes to me and they say, I think there's really amazing evidence that the gospel according to St. John is an eyewitness account, and the gospel according to St. John attests to all these details about Jesus' resurrection and the people to whom he appeared. Okay, and then I pivot and I start saying, well, here's why I'm not convinced by St. Paul, right? Well, that is on topic for the broader topic of the debate, but a question has been posed about a line of evidence. So the answer needs to address the line of evidence, right? Yeah. And so talking about a completely unrelated criticism of the resurrection evidence does not address the question that's posed about the Marian apparitions.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have these, I think, polemical moments of Jesus saying, no, like touch my feet, watch me eat some fish. Which seems like a sort of odd thing to to prioritize. Unless you want to say that the glorified resurrected body gets hungry very easily. It seems strange that one of the first priorities of Jesus would be, give me the fish so I can eat it in front of you and prove that I'm physical. It would seem a little bit strange. On the point of sort of group hallucinations, as it were, I don't know if these things occur. What I know is that we've got lots of reports throughout history of people claiming to see some very strange things. I like to talk about Mormonism.
So if you don't know whether something occurs, why are you here debating this? I'm confused.
Well, I mean, so people have made weird claims throughout history. Ergo, what? What's the next? What's the therefore? What's the, so people have made weird claims. These are weird claims. So therefore, these claims must be equally credible as those weird claims. And there must be an explanation that works within my worldview for all of these claims that is the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't really compute.
Yeah, no, that was my impression as well. It's like, what are you actually trying to say here? Yeah, I mean, there's multiple questions that are raised, but let's continue because he's about to pivot to Mormonism.
And I like to do it for a few reasons. Firstly, because it usually offers a bit of a sort of left field comparison for Christians, but also in this context, I know that Trent has spent a lot of time looking into Mormonism and debating Mormonism. I would like to tell people, for example, that if you pick up any copy of the Book of Mormon, it always begins with testimonies from first the 3 witnesses and then secondly the 8 witnesses. And these are men who claimed to see, in the first instance, Joseph Smith, the golden plates of Joseph Smith be handed by an angel to Joseph Smith. Now, those first 3 witnesses claimed that they saw this. Now, it's a little bit complicated because it's like 2 of them saw it at the same time and then 1 of them saw it later. And you might say that he was hallucinating, but I would say, how do you account for the corroboration between that and the other 2? At the very least, these men who claimed to see something, collect.
So, okay, well, I'm going to give us context about the testimony of the 3 and the 8, and so I will get into that shortly. But I also want to point out something here. Does Alex not believe that they were hallucinating? Nor that they were lying? Then what does he believe occurred? Right? Because he's an atheist, right? That's his thing. Right. So what does he think happened? Either he does believe that it's plausible that these are purely natural experiences and that these testimonies are not reporting like veridical supernatural experiences, in which case, then if those testimonies can be debunked, it doesn't follow that very different testimony pertaining to these Marian apparitions can be debunked along similar lines, right? So it's not actually clear what he's saying here, right? Because if he's trying to rule out natural explanations for it would make sense if what he was saying is, the evidence for Marian apparitions is only as good as these testimonies from these Book of Mormon witnesses, and since there's a natural explanation of these, then it's plausible there's a naturalistic explanation of those. Now, every single aspect of that would be problematic, but that would actually make sense as an argument. But if he's saying there is no natural explanation for the Book of Mormon witnesses, then how does that fit within his worldview? How do you reconcile that with his paradigm? But if you want, Cameron, I can now get into providing the audience with context about these Book of Mormon witnesses, if you'd like.
Let's continue in the clip a little bit because he does talk a little bit more about them in the visionary aspect or the spiritual eyes aspect. So let's just play that and then get into it.
Collectively.
Cool.
Which I don't think Trent can grant happened. I don't think he can grant that an angel gave Joseph Smith the golden plates.
Well, neither can you.
And yet, they claim to have seen this. And there's something extra here that you don't get in the Christian tradition, which is that it's kind of a reverse Paul. People often say, well, Paul used to persecute Christians, so why would he see this vision? This is the other way around, and I think therefore stronger. All 3 of these men were eventually excommunicated from the Mormon church. They fell out with Joseph Smith, and they were excommunicated from the church, yet until the day of their death, they asserted that they had seen the Book of Mormon. It's complicated. As Trent knows, Martin Harris is said to have sort of seen the plates with his spiritual eyes. So I'm attempting to draw an analogy here, right? So Martin Harris is one of the 3 witnesses, the other being Oliver Cowdery and David Whitman. And
just keep in mind that we're talking about Marian apparitions.
But okay, let me now just actually provide us with context about this, because I think now it's time, even though he keeps going. So the first thing to understand here is that the testimonies from the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses that are produced in the Book of Mormon are actually statements that were substantially drafted by Joseph Smith himself after these events took place, where Joseph Smith is writing up for people a statement and in order to give favorable testimony regarding the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. He's writing a statement to these witnesses and he's giving it over to them to sign it, right? And then a lot of the context that we're going to get about the actual nature of the experiences that are being reported by these witnesses are coming years and years later when these witnesses are being asked and then giving subsequent clarifications. And then we actually see that even after they've signed these statements and they've rose to these positions of prominence within the Mormon church and they're being asked to give clarifications about it, oftentimes the clarifications are showing us that the language of these statements that were drafted by Joseph Smith and given over to these witnesses was actually very misleading, okay? And actually, so it's like the actual language of the statements that is the signed testimony of the witnesses does not reflect the experiences that the witnesses themselves would actually later clarify that they had, but would give a misleading impression to anyone who read it if they didn't have further later context from the witnesses clarifying what these statements meant. So that's already pretty suspicious and pretty bad, right? So it's not like there's contemporaneous documentation of what these people saw. In fact, the only even near contemporaneous documentation of the experiences is being mediated through the leader of the cult, Joseph Smith. And we actually have later testimony showing that Joseph Smith had to pressure, so specifically with the 8 witnesses who said they saw and handled the plates. We have later testimony from a Mormon insider who deconverted from Mormonism on this basis, where it's Martin Harris explaining that the 8 witnesses never actually physically saw the plates, but they saw them with their spiritual eyes or some kind of imaginary vision, and they handled them through a cloth that was being used to conceal the plates. Now, the statement of the 8 witnesses totally implies the opposite. And what was actually divulged to us is that the witnesses on this basis were reluctant to sign the instrument because the language was so misleading, but they were pressured by Joseph and they agreed to sign it anyways, which is showing you why it's so problematic, right? And then memory effects make it even worse afterwards, especially after you've tied your reputation to it because you've been pressured or cajoled by Smith into signing it. Now, what is the nature? So with regard to the 8 witnesses, that testimony has very little value on that basis alone, right? But then, so let's keep going further, digging deeper.
Dig deeper in just a second. I want to ask a clarifying question. How credible is that testimony that Joseph Smith was the one who sort of coerced them into signing?
Okay, well, so that Joseph Smith drafted it, very secure historically, even just based off of internal evidence from the witness statements, where it seems like it's actually from Joseph's prophetic vocabulary that the statements are being written in, right? And the names are being signed to them. Now, that the 8 witnesses were reluctant to sign the instrument, that testimony is actually very credible, because we're getting it secondhand from Martin Harris, right, who's one of the 3 Book of Mormon witnesses, who's making a statement against interest. And Martin Harris will later express regret for having clarified this, but so we have a person who's a Mormon insider who's saying he really didn't want to deconvert from Mormonism, but he did once he heard this from Martin Harris, right? And we have independent corroboration besides this guy too, but he's writing a letter. And in this letter to this other guy where he's explaining why he feels like the edifice of Mormonism has collapsed, when he realized that the people never saw with their physical eyes the plates, but in fact that the plates, they saw them through cloth and they handled them through cloth, but they had an imaginary vision, which makes sense. It makes sense that the plates couldn't pass visual inspection. Why is that? Well, because Joseph Smith refused to show them to anybody, right? So like Emma Smith wasn't able to look at them through the cloth, right? Even his own wife can't look at it. And lots of people who wanted to see them were not allowed to look at them through the cloth, as they were either concealed in a box or they were wrapped in this cloth, right? So why aren't people being allowed to look at the plates? Like if our Lord is willing to appear to people in a resurrected body in front of 500 people, or if our Lord is willing to work miracles that are seen by like 1 million people at Zeitoun, right? Or predict in advance mass spectacles witnessed by hundreds of thousands in Fatima, why won't he let people look at plates? Why do the plates have to be concealed? And then the plates, after all of this, disappear. So after the translation is finished, what happens of the plates? What comes of them? So the only thing we're getting is this testimony of the 8 witnesses mediated to us through a statement written by Joseph, where we have very credible testimony from Mormon insiders that people were reluctant to sign the statement because it was so misleading and implying that they had seen the plates with their physical eyes, and who nonetheless reluctantly did so, right? And so and then we look. Oh yeah. Sorry.
I was just going to say, the way that you're describing this, dude, it's exactly like Fatima. Like there's just so many parallels between this and Fatima.
I want to get even more direct in our comparisons here. So let's go to this testimony of the 3, because I think the testimony of the 8 is of negligible value. Like, and the best things they have for later corroborations of it are like either it's stuff that's going against the physical nature of the experience, or it's literally just like simple affirmations of the ambiguous and confusing language of the earlier statement, right? And this is coming very late testimony. So the main things that are of value are actually the testimony of the 3, where what they're claiming is more of like a visionary experience with an angel in the plates, right? So their experience by their own reckoning is more like this like supernatural subjective type of experience rather than just mundane physical experience. Now, what Alex tells you there is that there's some weird circumstances surrounding it but what he doesn't tell you is that the actual testimony that we have, the near contemporaneous testimony that we have, doesn't include those clarifications. The clarifications that he's giving are later clarifications given by the witnesses when they're subsequently asked. But the statement that's drafted by Joseph is basically outright deceptive. Because if you go read for yourself the testimony of the 3 witnesses in the Book of Mormon, it'll sound like it was a group experience involving 3 people who all saw the same thing at the same time. That's what it'll sound like. But it turns out that David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery are having a completely separate experience from Martin Harris. So all of them are going, and notice this testimony doesn't even tell us like the date, time, location when supposedly this occurred, right? And it's not actually directly from the witnesses themselves. Again, it's mediated. And the language that was chosen in a way that is intentionally misleading. The witnesses themselves were promised by Joseph that they would have the visionary experiences that they had, and then were praying longingly and intensely to prime themselves to try to have this visionary experience. And Martin Harris fails to have it, so he has to have it later when Joseph Smith is praying with him, right? So they're alone, and they have to pray to get Martin Harris to have another experience. Now, he says, well, how do you explain how similar all the experiences they had are? We don't know what the experiences they had were. We know what Joseph Smith wrote down, and obviously Joseph Smith's incentive is to portray it as if they're all having the same experience at the same time. But we know that that was already misleading. And then all these people, it's years later through repeatedly rehearsing a story, right, that they've literally been coached to have convergent testimony with each other after the instrument is prepared by Smith and given over to them. So we know the original language was actually misleading in a way where it's stitching together 2 completely independent experiences that are had by people who are heavily trying to prime themselves to have these experiences, right? And who have a long desire. And 2 of them are already very convinced believers at this point, and Martin Harris is desperate for confirmation. He turns out he's the one that needs to have a separate experience from the rest of the group. But okay, let's look a little further though, because this is really important. So the number of testimonies that a person can produce actually doesn't matter nearly as much as the credibility of the testimonies that the person produces, right? I can go and I can get a random person that nobody's ever heard of to sign a statement saying that basically anything has occurred, right? And people lie all the time. There are lots of people out there who are deluded, right? So just credibility matters a lot more than quantity when it comes to testimony. But let's actually do an examination of the testimony for credibility. So Alex gives us one argument to regard the testimony as credible, which is that the people didn't recant later, even though they had a falling out with Smith. Now we can return to that and talk about why that's not actually a great credibility indicator. But first, let's just get context on why the 3 witnesses are some of the least credible people that could give testimony about any matter, to where you wouldn't accept their testimony about even a trivial matter on the basis of testimony as weak as the affirmations of these 3 witnesses. So let's just start out with Martin Harris. One thing that's really important to know about Martin Harris is that he's like a borderline schizophrenic individual who claims to be having visionary experiences all the time, both before and after this event occurs. So Martin Harris thinks that Jesus Christ appeared to him as a deer. He thinks that every rustling of the wind is Satan. He goes around boldly and publicly and repeatedly proclaiming false prophecies based on private experiences that he's had, that none of them come to pass. So for instance, he signs an instrument saying that he consents to have his appendages severed from him if it turns out that by like 1838, all the Christian sects have not been dissolved and gathered under the Mormonite sect. So he's going out and making false prophecies like that based off of these visionary experiences. He has a visionary background of using seer stones, right? So looking into stones to hunt for buried treasure, just like Joseph Smith did. And he's embedded within this folk magic culture that's very much about having imaginary visions related to magical practices in order to go do all this superstitious stuff. So he is a person who is among the least credible people in the world to give testimony regarding an imaginary vision that he's had to corroborate the Book of Mormon completely independently of the rest of the witnesses. Not to mention, if we just wanted to posit fraud on his part, or at least heavy bias and motivation, another thing we haven't mentioned is that he's mortgaged his farm to finance the production of the Book of Mormon, and that his entire livelihood depends upon this financial investment that he has that depends on the success of the Book of Mormon, which is now, we're soliciting testimony from him in furtherance of the Book of Mormon, even though he took on a massive financial interest in favor of it. And so I'll go really quickly through the other two witnesses, but lo and behold, they're not more credible either. So all of them also have visionary histories. All of them are involved in the folk magic context of this local community that Joseph Smith is a part of. Oliver Cowdery can be demonstrated to have committed perjury in an 1830 trial where he lies about how the Book of Mormon was translated, where he's making it seem like Joseph Smith used the plates to produce the translation, even though all the contemporaneous witnesses say that Joseph Smith used seer stones to produce the translations of the Book of Mormon. So Oliver Cowdery showed in the years after he gives this testimony, like almost immediately after, he shows he's willing to lie under oath in court to advance the interests of Joseph Smith. So that's pretty bad credibility indicator if we're going to rest our case on Oliver Cowdery's testimony, if he's willing to perjure himself to support Smith. And you look at a guy like David Whitmer, we have documents from the 1830s signed by 80, more than 80 actually, Mormons that had interacted with David Whitmer that are accusing him of various crimes, including dishonesty and business dealings, a whole bunch of business-related fraud. Basically, they seriously impugned the integrity of David Whitmer. Okay, so none of these guys, Cowdery, Harris, Whitmer, they are extremely lacking in credibility to attest to the claims that they're attesting to. The testimony that they're giving is vague. It's mediated through Joseph Smith. It's occurring because they're seeking it out actively through psychologically priming themselves to have experiences of a sort that they are routinely having within this context. And all of them are willing to lie, and all of them are heavily biased and motivated at the times that they're providing this testimony. So that leaves us with, okay, well, what about this argument that Alex is giving us, which is, well, they never recanted, right? They never recanted. So, and even though they had falling out with Joseph Smith, even though they were excommunicated by Joseph Smith, they never recanted, right? So doesn't that prove that they were telling the truth? No, that's not how this works at all. So first thing that's really important, though, to keep in mind is that Joseph Smith himself is impeaching the character and attacking the integrity of all three of these men after they have falling outs with him. So even the guy who drafted the statement is now saying that these guys are sort of unreliable, like bad, villainous people, because he has these personal conflicts with them and he speaks against them. So that's already not a good credibility indicator for their testimonies, right? But okay, well, why wouldn't they recant? Well, one thing is it's entirely possible that they sincerely believed, or that they exaggerated, and that their memory was distorted over time, as often happens, especially through repeated rehearsal, and especially when people are really motivated and invested in something, and especially when basically just through the telling, you wind up making it to where you have greater and greater exaggeration and embellishment to make things seem like a bigger deal than they were, right? So that's already, so even if you granted that they weren't consciously lying, it's entirely possible for them not to be consciously lying, but for their testimony to be substantially false, just because it became so exaggerated and because of memory effects and rehearsal and psychological pressures. But second is, even if they were lying, they could have been consciously perpetrating a fraud. But hey, he's not mentioning one thing. All of us lied to you guys for years and got you to join a religion under false pretexts. Hi, I'm admitting to that. No, lots of people are not going to want to do that. There's actually really good psychological reasons that even if you were lying, you don't want to admit to a huge number of people that you were just like pathologically lying to them over a period of years about defrauding them. So what do they tell? They tell the nearest close story. Oh, Joseph Smith is a fallen prophet. Yeah, I had the experiences I had, but Joseph Smith is a fallen prophet. Some of them go off and start their own sects. Some of them go and follow other false prophets besides Joseph Smith afterwards. So that's what they're doing afterward. So they're not admitting, oh yeah, we defrauded all you guys. And when we kept repeatedly giving our testimony over all these years, all of that was a conscious fraud to just deceive you guys. Yeah, that would be a very embarrassing against interest statement to make. So they do the best thing they can, which is say, well, yeah, Joseph Smith is a fallen prophet. We really had the experiences that we had. So we're not admitting that we lied about those, but we're not buying into Joseph Smith's cult anymore. And so even if they were consciously lying and defrauding people, that would be a perfectly reasonable explanation. But you don't have to believe that they did, because there's lots of other ways that their testimony can be substantially false and unreliable. So finally, this will be my last point before letting you jump back in, Cameron. But finally, let's just set that side by side by Fatima. Okay? So we have a group of the least trustworthy people on the planet that we've put together, the least credible group of people on the planet, who can't even have a group experience involving all three of them after all of them are like consciously priming themselves to have this group experience. They can't even elicit that. So they have to stitch together two completely unrelated experiences at unknown dates that are just one-off experiences. Okay, contrast that with Fatima, where you have three people who show throughout this process that they really have high integrity, they have really low suggestibility, they seem very psychologically balanced and stable. They show that they're willing to be honest. They show that they're very lucid, that they're sane people. They don't go off and have all these other crazy, fantastical visionary experiences and false prophecies, etc., unconnected with the apparitions. They have group experiences that are complex, multimodal experiences. They enact them in front of crowds, being live observed by those crowds. All the experiences occur according to a pre-announced schedule where they're announcing in advance, here's the time and dates and locations where all this is going to occur, and everyone can come watch us throughout all of these experiences. We're having contemporaneous interrogations, both together and apart, of these witnesses, where we're taking down exactly what their testimony was. They're making advanced predictions of events that are then witnessed by more than 100,000 people spread out over a 100-kilometer radius, where we have convergent undesigned coincidences between them, where we have hostile witnesses, neutral witnesses, tons of corroboration and convergent elements between the accounts. We have physical corroboration with photographs showing that there was a light source at a non-solar elevation during the event. We're showing that there was infrared radiant drying that caused rapid drying of clothes, which corroborates witness testimony. We have 15,000 healings with medical documentation accompanying it. So that's the evidence we're dealing with for something like Fatima. And so Alex O'Connor is trying to maintain that the Book of Mormon witnesses are equally inexplicable. It's ridiculous.
So I was actually going to ask you to compare it to Fatima. So I appreciate you doing that. Yeah, it's just it's remarkable. So what Alex actually does, though, we'll get back to his clips here in a second. What he actually does, though, is he tries to tie it back to the resurrection accounts as opposed to discussing the question, which was about Marian apparitions. That's what he was supposed to be addressing. But then he tries to say, well, these accounts are just as credible as the accounts that we have for the resurrection. So he's sort of dodging the question, or maybe changing the goalpost, or moving the goalpost rather. It's really bad. It's really unfortunate. Let's get back to the clip.
In 1838, Stephen Burnett claims that Martin Harris didn't see it with his natural eyes, but that it was a kind of vision. But then Martin Harris later said, look, as surely as I see my hands, I saw the golden plates. What I want to point out is that there are analogs here, which is that you've got this sort of claim of
analogs to Marian apparitions, or analogs to the resurrection accounts?
Group appearances, which seem a little bit strange. You've got this kind of reason why maybe they wouldn't want to make this claim. And then you've got this slight debate over, well, was it physical? Was it spiritual? We're not entirely sure.
Wait, pause. So notice there. So Martin Harris prevaricates about the nature of his experience. So he's admitting that he saw it only with his spiritual eyes. But then as he was coached to by Joseph Smith, he's comparing the spiritual eye to the natural eye, which is something they were coached to do, after he's expressing regret about clarifying that this is the spiritual eyes versus the natural eyes. The guy himself, he says, oh, there's reasons why he wouldn't want to be making this claim. No, there's not. There was none at the time. What is the reason? He mortgaged his farm and had a giant financial interest in whether the Book of Mormon was really successful. The testimony he was giving was massively conducive to the success of the Book of Mormon. We know at the time that he had the experiences, he was really desirous of having an experience. So it's not at all true that he has good reasons not to give this claim. Now, the guy is completely erratic, right? He's like not a mentally stable person. He's mentally deranged, Martin Harris. So like he's going to do lots of irrational, inexplicable stuff probably throughout his life. And he follows other false prophets besides Joseph Smith. But like this idea that because he didn't recant, therefore he didn't have a reason to make the false claim in the first place? No. And he had plenty of reason not to recant. Yeah, can you imagine it? Like if I come out to you and I say, I convinced you guys to change your entire lives, to change your entire religion, to bet your entire souls on joining this sect. Oops, that was a lie. I was lying to you guys. Sorry. I really needed that book to sell well. No, you'd probably get killed. So he has a really good reason not to recant, even if you were lying, which I'm not saying he was, because the guy is thinking Jesus is appearing to him as a deer. So I just think he's probably just not all there.
All right, yeah, let's continue. The part that I really want to get to is the transfiguration of Brigham Young.
People often talk about the persecution of the apostles. So when I bring up the Mormon church, people say, oh yeah, but you don't understand that Christians were persecuted. They were put to death by Nero and Diocletian. And I'm like, have you looked into Mormon history? Do you not know that in the lifetimes of these witnesses and other witnesses to Mormon miracles, Mormons were persecuted by the United States of America? There was the Mormon Extermination Act in Missouri, which literally called for the extermination and expulsion of Mormons. They were chased out of basically every state that they went into. In other words, I'd like to know how we explain that. There's then the 8 witnesses who don't witness the angel, but they do witness the golden plates. 8 of them who, again, 3 of those guys also lose touch with the Mormon church, fall out with Joseph Smith and get excommunicated, but still attest that that's what they saw.
Another thing to really keep in mind with the 8 witnesses that we didn't mention, really funny Mark Twain quote, I couldn't have been more satisfied if the entire Whitmer family had testified, which is 5 of these people are relatives of David Whitmer, and 3 of them are relatives of Joseph Smith. Those are the 8 witnesses. It's like a school project. It's like you went home for a school project. You went over to the Whitmer family, and you went over to the Smith family, and you have Smith's dad signing off on it. And you have Whitmer's brother-in-law signing off on it is the only one that doesn't even have the last name Whitmer of the 5 Whitmer witnesses. One of these guys, Hiram Page, he's going to be using a seer stone. He's a Book of Mormon witness. He's going to use a seer stone to receive revelations later. And Joseph Smith is going to come and authoritatively condemn these revelations as either demonic or just psychologically coming from Hiram Page. And then meanwhile, who was duped by it? Oh, Oliver Cowdery and the entire Whitmer family accepted Hiram Page's false revelations, which Smith then comes and condemns. So we're talking about this group of people. And if you throw around numbers to people who don't know the context, then you can pretend that things are comparable when they're not. But what really matters for witnesses is credibility. And that's something that all of these people are totally lacking.
More to the point, though, there's this extraordinary event which I found when I was researching the history of the Mormon Church a while ago, which is a transfiguration event. It's absolutely extraordinary. So in 1840,
yeah, absolutely extraordinary.
I'm sure Trent will be familiar with this. In 1844, there was something of a succession crisis, right? Joseph Smith had died. And
by the way, Trent needs to work on his facial expressions here. He needs to work on his facial expressions in between debates.
Died, and they didn't know who was going to be the next leader. So they called a conference in August, on the 8th of August. Brigham Young is one of the speakers. Now, we know from Brigham Young's later diaries that he says that there were thousands of people present. He says there were thousands of people at this conference. So let's say there were at least a few hundred. And amazingly, George Cannon writes in 1870, which is just 26 years later, that Brigham Young, while speaking, vying for the leadership.
Wait, pause. Just 26 years later. Let's keep that in mind. Incredible. Just 26 years later. Let's keep going.
Transfigures into the image and likeness and voice of Joseph Smith. He says, who that was present on that occasion can ever forget the impression it made upon them? If Joseph had risen from the dead and spoken in their hearing, the effect could not have been more startling than it was to many present at that meeting. So
again, what he's trying to do is draw this comparison between the gospel accounts, which are later, and Mormonism, right? And this transfiguration, this 26 years later account of the transfiguration of Brigham Young into Joseph Smith, which again is just not the question, is about these Marian apparitions, which are contemporaneous. We have photographs.
Here's what he's completely neglecting about the transfiguration. We have contemporary diaries from people that were present at the speech. We have people talking about the speech right after it happened. None of them mention the transfiguration. The first reference to this transfiguration is years later, even though there's lots of contemporary reportage about the very speech where this supposedly occurred. So obviously, if it was like the resurrection of Joseph Smith and he visibly transformed into Joseph Smith in front of a crowd of thousands and everybody's writing about it, you're not going to forget that detail. Everybody's going to forget it until they're coming up with like a hagiography lore to justify Brigham Young's dubious succession claim to be Mormon leader. And that's when all these later reminiscences start popping up, right when it's basically the collective consciousness of Mormons is trying to justify Brigham Young's claims through like retrojecting this extraordinary event. So notice this did not occur. This transfiguration did not occur. We have contemporaneous documents that are going to basically completely refute it. If it occurred, it would show up in these reports and records that we have that are earlier. Instead, it's only being embellished way later. Now, what does this show? It has some relevance to the resurrection, though I don't think it actually has as much as he thinks it does, which we can get into in a moment, right? But what it shows is that if you have a religious community of people who are highly motivated, that they can confabulate basically extraordinary events that occurred in the past, even when nothing that recognizably was related to that actually occurred in the past, right? So that's what this incident shows. Now, that has nothing to do with Marian apparitions. Why does it have nothing to do with the Marian apparitions? Because we have contemporaneous documents from the day of by tons of hostile and neutral observers, right? We have records of the interrogation transcripts with the visionaries, We have physical evidence corroborating the testimony of these witnesses, right? And all of this, so this is all gold standard evidence for these Marian apparitions. And so to then to say that the transfiguration of Brigham Young is comparable to those, which is actually the question, right? Now we can go back and we can talk about the resurrection and say, oh, is it plausible that something similar to what happened with Brigham Young happened here with the resurrection? I don't think so, and we can get more into that. But notice, it's not at all even remotely close to what he needs to actually refute Marian apparitions.
Yeah, I don't think we need to get into the resurrection accounts at this point because the whole stream is about Marian apparitions. Like that's what we're supposed to be discussing. So that's what I want to focus on here. We can maybe do something later on that, but let's try to stay on topic, even though Alex is having
but it shows a very basic point. This is all it shows. That under certain conditions, people can make up events that didn't happen in the past, that are extraordinary, that are convenient for them, and that suit their rhetorical agenda. That's possible. That's what all the transfiguration of Brigham Young shows. It has no relevance at all whatsoever to a comparison with any of the Marian apparitions or Marian phenomena. And if we want to talk about the resurrection, then that's when you would get into talking about, not all testimony is created equal. It's possible in principle for people to confabulate events like this. But due to the nature of the claims, due to the nature of the testimonies that we have, due to the surrounding contemporary context and physical circumstances that we can verify both directly and indirectly based on the evidence we have, it's not going to be a plausible theory in this case, even if it was a plausible theory in that case. But we won't go into that because that's not our focus.
Yeah, this is still relevant though. The Marian apparitions, again, to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, they support the resurrection itself, right? And so you would want to discuss those. You would want to, especially this is the topic of the question, you would want to discuss that in this context. If you're asking a question about whether or not the resurrection actually occurred, we have these other events that seem to corroborate it in a sort of indirect way. And so you would still want to address them. You would still want to say something about them. And this is what we get. This is what we get instead, is this transfiguration 26 years later mentioned in this random document. Didn't you say though that you found other sources that date earlier for the transfiguration?
For the transfiguration, you can get them within 7 years or so, 7 or 9 years. You can show through all these reminiscences of the transfiguration, they all contradict each other. Nobody can get their story straight about what happened, obviously, because it's a completely fake event. So, so the people, the details are different depending on who, and they get more extraordinary over time. So it shows you how legendary embellishment can occur, right? Now, it's, oh yeah, no.
I was going to just continue with the clip, but unless you've got something else, feel free.
No, let's keep going.
Okay.
We've got this report of probably hundreds of people seeing quite a miraculous event. Now, you could say, well, that report comes 26 years later. Okay. And how much later were Paul's reports? How much later were the gospel reports? Also note that in
Paul's reports were not 26 years later. We've got 1 Corinthians 15. I said I didn't want to get into it, but couldn't help myself. Yeah, they were not 26 years later.
I mean, I also take early dates for all the Gospels. So, I mean, again, that's not the point of this stream, but I take early dates. I don't accept critical dates for the Gospels. But the idea, Paul's letters being written, like, let's just say mid-50s, okay? Let's say we give him, just very generous, we'd say, let's just do Paul's letters, and then let's not even say that we can see that the creeds date earlier, right? Or they preserve a historical memory, right? So they are earlier than 26. But the whole point is not that in later reminiscences that you couldn't describe events that didn't recognizably take place in a later reminiscence. No, we're obviously, all of us are going to have to concede that that's possible in principle for people to say things happened in the past when they didn't actually happen, right? So we all agree with that. Now, the question is just going to be, is there a symmetry? Is there a parity between these cases? Are the reasons equally good across these cases? Which I don't think there is. But again, let's talk about Marian apparitions. That is the question. So I've got newspapers, I've got photographs, I've got interrogations from the day before, the day of. I've got them for all of these 6 events conforming to the pre-announced schedule. I've got people, 40 kilometers away writing it down. I've got letters, I've got diaries. So let's talk about those.
Yeah, unfortunately, we will not talk about any of that stuff.
1857, which is just 13 years after this event, after the Transfiguration, you have Albert Carrington's experience recorded, where Carrington says that, Brigham Young recounts Albert Carrington's experience and says that Carrington says that people could not tell him from Joseph Smith and could not see anyone but Joseph speaking. What you'll notice...
So coming from Brigham Young himself. I mean, isn't the point, though, that there was a succession crisis right after Joseph Smith was killed in a shootout? I know that Mormons really hate that term. Maybe we can talk about that for a second. Yeah, what is the definition of a shootout? And does this event of Joseph Smith dying in a jail cell, does that meet the criteria?
Yeah, and so in fairness to the Mormons, there's another description of the same event, which is there was an armed mob that came to do like mob justice against Joseph Smith, right? And so it was a very lopsided confrontation between this mob and Smith. However, it does satisfy, because people have gotten on my case for using this term, it does satisfy the definition of a shootout, which is there was an exchange of gunfire between 2 or more parties. There were even casualties on both sides. Joseph Smith discharges his pistol and wounds 2 people. So he's firing a deadly weapon, firing a gun, discharging the gun, creating casualties. And then he dies jumping out the window. And for context for everybody, this is occurring shortly after he favorably compared himself to Jesus by saying that even Jesus couldn't create a church that hung together as well as Joseph Smith. And so now, he became a rotting corpse. And that's where he is now.
Notice is that there's still this evidence that there's some kind of transfigurative event, but much less detailed, but much more close to the source. In 1869, 25 years later, so somewhere in the middle, Orson Hyde, who was an early Mormon leader, confirms the event, saying it was the voice of Joseph, and there were the features, gestures, and even the stature of Joseph. So what we have are 3 independent, in one case, eyewitness account, because Orson Hyde was actually speaking on the same day at the conference, eyewitness accounts of a transfiguration of Brigham Young in front of hundreds of witnesses, many of whom, in the words of George Cannon, he says, who was present on that occasion that could ever forget this? In other words, if you're in any doubt about this, you could go and ask the witnesses who were there.
Well,
Now,
actually, yeah, the people that could forget about it was everybody who wrote about it right when it happened. That's who forgot about it. Everybody who was there who wrote about it right at the time it occurred, and not after we were creating this like hagiography of Brigham Young to justify his completely baseless succession claim.
Now, shelve that for a moment and think about how people talk about things like, Trent's already mentioned the appearances that Paul recounts in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says that Jesus appeared to Peter, which is strange because we don't get that narrated in the gospel stories, even though that seems to be the first and most important. But I mean, most pressingly, Paul says that Jesus appears to 500 people, as above 500 people, probably more than possibly above in a visionary experience. That's something else. And people say, look, this is our only source. But, Paul says some of these people are still alive. So if you were in any doubt, you could just go and ask them. And I would say, well, why didn't people go and ask about the Mormon transfiguration experiences? Perhaps because if you read George Q. Cannon's account, it's not clear who these people are. I mean, people often say this. They say, those 500 people, some of them are still alive, so you could have gone and checked. How? You're just going to walk to Jerusalem, which has tens of thousands of people at minimum in it, and just start asking around and see if anyone's seen the risen Christ? How many no's would it take before you said, oh?
I think it was in Galilee, was it not? The 500, the group appearance to the 500. Maybe I'm mistaken about that, but
it just doesn't matter anyways, because the whole point was, after this, we're going to do a missionary effort where we're going to evangelize the world, right? And so the people we sent out are, for instance, the apostles, who are going to be witnesses to the resurrected Christ. And we're also sending out all these other people who are disciples, right, of Jesus, who are the early Christians, who have these experiences. And so if you're a person who's an inquirer who wants to be how do I know that this really happened? If you go talk to early Christians, it seems very likely they're going to be oh yeah, here's a guy you can speak to. Yeah, here's the guy who's going and proselytizing everybody about this, right? And so especially if you're invoking these people as evidence to prove the claim, and then you're causing extremely rapid conversions of large numbers of people, and you're saying your whole religion rests on the credibility of this claim, right? In the Mormon case, the credibility of their religion mostly rested on the claims of the Book of Mormon witnesses, right? And so they went and they proselytized on that basis. And anybody who asked who the Book of Mormon witnesses were could get an answer and could go hear from these people, right? And it was a similar situation within the early Christian context, that these people are going to a very hostile audience, coming to them with an extraordinary claim, and these people then are going to inquire. And so what we know is that the early Christians were saying, here's our evidence base. And so if you want further context or clarification, clearly it's going to be very contrary to the evangelical goals of the early Christians. If they say oh yeah, well, these 500 witnesses, nobody really knows who they are. And, they go to another school in Canada. That clearly wasn't going to be the attitude of the early Christians when pressed on this claim. They were going to refer you to witnesses so that you could ask them questions. And in many cases, it's the witnesses themselves. They're the ones going and bearing witness in front of crowds.
And then the apostles were then performing all these signs and wonders. And we do. Yeah, go ahead.
No. And that's an important thing too. I mean, another thing that I think some of this stuff can emphasize is how the broader context of the gospel narrative surrounding Christ are really important, right? Which is, it's not just an individual claim about a set of experiences with the resurrected Christ upon which the basically spread of Christianity is going to rest. It's going to rest in large part on one, when they're doing an evangelical mission to the Jews, showing that the life of Christ is the fulfillment of messianic prophecy, right? And so insofar as those details about Christ's actual life and ministry are being related to people, that's going to be a key pillar, especially for somebody like an early convert like Paul, who's very hostile, who's a very well-educated Jew, who's very firmly rooted in Scripture. One of the things he's going to care most about is whether there's plausibility to Jesus's claims to have fulfilled messianic prophecy, right? Then another element is there credibility to all the miracles that Jesus is performing during his lifetime throughout his ministry, right? And so in Pentecost, what's being related in the book of Acts is that that's something that's being invoked as one of their premier apologetic arguments, is that he performed miracle signs and wonders amongst the Jews in their midst during his ministry, not just exclusively pertaining to his resurrection, right? And then and the apostles themselves are in a context where people are going to believe in magic and sorcery and stuff, so they're going to need some pretty spectacular stuff to be impressed, right? So and meanwhile, the apostles are all claiming for themselves to have received from Jesus superpowers, including Paul in his letters is claiming that he himself has superpowers. And he says, you didn't really hear my wise and persuasive words. The way I proved it to you guys was through demonstrating my superpowers to you so that your faith could rest on the power of God and not the wisdom of men. That's what he's saying, right? And so if these guys are claiming to have unlimited superpowers from God incarnate and are going around performing all these miracles to convert the pagan masses who are extremely hostile to Christianity, they better be doing some impressive superpower stuff.
Yeah, and do we have any of that in Mormonism? Well, other than the Transfiguration.
Well, actually, we have something in Mormonism to unfavorably compare, which is I have tons of testimony and even newspaper reports that the early Mormons were notorious for failed attempts at healing people. So basically, 30% of the time or whatever, you can get people who will favorably respond to placebo, But like the Mormons were really racking up a reputation for like Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon had at various points made claims to basically have the power to perform all miracles and stuff that are then just getting discredited because they're going around and praying for people and attempting exorcisms and doing stuff like that, and it's not working. And so then the Mormons will just fixate. If you take a huge sample of people and you fail for the vast majority, and then you get a notorious reputation as a failure, then the Mormon bias sources will just focus on the times when like a guy responds to placebo or whatever. And even the claims they're making are like nowhere near as extraordinary as like, okay, a guy has been blind his entire life and then you're restoring sight to him. You know, guy's been paralyzed for his entire life and then you're just telling him to walk and he's getting up instantly. They're not doing anything remotely comparable.
All right, let's at this point turn to super chats. We've got a number that have come in, so let's cover some of them now. Ethan, do you think Mormon supposed miracles are demonic or naturalistic or a combination of both?
So as we just talked about, I think Mormon miracles are just in general not credible at all, to where you could give naturalistic explanations for what occurred, because they're just not credible evidence that, like, for instance, the transfiguration of Brigham Young was a historical event that occurred, but instead it's clearly a legendary embellishment after the fact that's sort of self-serving, right? Or you take another example, like the appearances to the 3 and the 8 witnesses. I mean, you could say that demons, gave them supernatural experiences. That's not ruled out, especially given the occult context in which all of this was occurring, right? And all these other ties to demons. Like, there's very credible evidence that I discussed in a recent debate that many of these guys are later going to go on to be possessed by demons and deceived by demons, according to Mormon-friendly sources, right? So, like, it's not off the table that it's demonic, but there's no need to posit demons, because also, like, we see that these people are mentally unstable, that they seem borderline psychotic or schizophrenic, that they have massive vested interests to lie, that they show that they lie and are disreputable in their dealings with others, both in their basically subsequent lives in connection with this. So, like, for those key foundational Mormon miracle claims, there's just no credibility. I just discussed how many failed healing attempts were associated with Mormons. So then if we just imagine combining basically the placebo effect plus dozens and dozens of failed attempts at like doing spirit healings and stuff like that, plus basically the same level of willingness to embellish that we saw from Mormons in connection with Brigham Young, right? So if they're willing to embellish, if they're able to embellish and confabulate the way they did with Brigham Young, it shows you how little value to put in Mormon historical recollections and reminiscences, right? Now, could there be things that are demonic that happen? Of course, I believe in demons. I believe demons do stuff all the time. I think there's very credible evidence of that I've discussed elsewhere. Could it be that God answers the prayers of some Mormons? Of course, right? Because within the context of these Mormon people that are being deceived, there could be many people who are pious, or who God wants to answer their prayer and show mercy on them, or who God wants to draw them out of the sect, and so he starts working with them, right? And so there's a broad range of possibilities for these claims, but none of them are even in the same comparison class as the massive public vindicatory miracles that are promulgating doctrinal revelations that we're discussing.
Next super chat. Love the Pints interview, Ethan. God bless you.
Hey, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was a really great interview, and looked sharp. You looked sharp. Druggin4168 has got 3 questions. He's actually sent in a number of super chats. We'll get through all of them. Can you do a video rebutting the best objections to Eucharistic miracles? I'm actually working on a video on that topic currently. Number 2, what's the strongest possible steelman case for LDS? 3, what does Ethan think is the best philosophical argument for God? We'll try to answer these quickly because he sent in a number of them.
Yeah, well, so you answered the first one. I think you're going to do content on that. I've addressed objections to Eucharistic miracles on my blog, specifically to the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano, and I intend to cover more Eucharistic miracles in the future. And I've been invited to do some content with people on Eucharistic miracles, so we'll see when that happens or if that pans out in the future. Strongest possible steelman case for LDS? Well, basically, I think their strongest case, and I think Mormonism is like one of the least credible religions ever, so even my steelman will not be that great. But basically what they do is they try to show BYU historians and like scientists and people who do stylometry and stuff like that they just pile up tons of scholarship trying to prove that the Book of Mormon itself is naturalistically inexplicable. And so it has all these features that can't be naturally explained. And then the person just needs to have certain criteria for excluding demons to say that, okay, if it's naturalistically inexplicable and it couldn't be from demons, then I guess it must be from God. And then they just need to say that, like, God can work with fallen, fallible men, right? So even if Joseph Smith was fallible, even if he did a lot of evil things, even if he made a lot of imprudent decisions, even if the surrounding context of early Mormons was full of people who had similar, rap sheets and shady backstories and stuff like that, that really the core issue is just, can the Book of Mormon be naturalistically explained? And then say, and it couldn't be demons because various arguments that Mormons like to make about fruits tests and their interpretations of that. So I don't think that's successful at all, but I think that's the best they can do. Then finally, what do I think is the best philosophical argument for God? It's a broad question, because first is, there are different arguments that will get you to different conclusions, right? So like, if I want to get to, there's like a first cause who's like the ultimate, simple, infinite, self-existent ground of all being, that's one type of argument. If I want to show that entity, the first cause, has consciousness, or it's intelligent, or it cares about us, there are different arguments I might give for that conclusion. But broadly speaking, arguments I really like, which I discussed in my interview about my conversion with Cameron, arguments I really like are first, like, arguments from skepticism. And you can see stuff that Alex Pruss has written about it. I like a sort of different spin on it. But basically, the idea of God being necessary as an epistemic bodyguard for us to prevent us from having certain skeptical scenarios and to ground a lot of the knowledge claims that we're strongly committed to, and showing that alternatives to theism basically lead to global skepticism or undermine the foundations of a lot of knowledge claims that we're strongly committed to. In addition to that, like metaphysical arguments, like I really like arguments from contingency and like the de ente proof that St. Thomas offers and things like that. But there's so many things I could go into, but those are two broad categories that I like.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to go to miracles. I still categorize the miracles argument as a philosophical argument, just because I assume so people know my stance on the miracle argument, and I think it's amazing, great, direct proof. When people ask me about philosophical, I assume they're talking about more traditional, like natural theology. Yeah. All right. What's the best objection against your view ever? I think I know. I think I know.
I don't know what view.
Ethan, what's your best objection against your view ever? Nettles.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
The Nettles objection to Catholicism. All right. Dragon has another one. How do you respond to people who say Yahweh and Jesus exist and do miracles, but they are not God, but just a powerful deities? Some Buddhists and Hindus believe that. This actually raises a good question I wanted to get into, which is that Protestants like Mike Licona, Gary Habermas, a lot of these guys working on the resurrection, a lot of the Protestants working on the resurrection, will use the resurrection event as proof of Christianity being true, right? And so what they're doing is essentially what we're doing with the Catholic miracles, is they're saying, well, this miracle, this event, has this sort of vindicatory element to it, which proves that Christianity is true. And then when they turn to discussing these Marian apparitions, it's like we just forget all of that. Like we forget the fact that a miracle can be vindicatory in this sense. And so I would assume that's going to be your response here, is that the vindicatory implications of the event themselves.
Well, no, what he's talking about here is different, because what he's saying is basically, imagine that we concede that there is a supernatural being that identifies itself as the Christian God, but the Christian God is not who it claims to be, right? So it's just some kind of powerful entity that isn't actually like the God of classical theism that it purports to be. And so basically this would leave us with two scenarios. Like, either this being, which is super powerful, super intelligent, is like deceived about its own nature and identity in a way that's sort of hard to fathom, like how you could be wrong, that like you're the self-existent ultimate ground of all being that's eternal, that's outside of time and space, upon which everything depends, and you communicate existence to everything that exists outside of you, and you have full knowledge and awareness of everything that's going on all the time. So it's not clear how you could be mistaken about that. It's a little bit of a baffling and confusing view. Or it's just lying, right? So it's like pretending to be that even though it's not, right? And all of this gets down to, it starts to become equivalent to like brain in a vat skeptical scenarios. Because what you're saying is there's a super powerful agent that is either itself deceived or has an intent to deceive in such a way that has created within it a very strong motivation to basically deceive all of us about the fundamental nature of reality. And so he's super powerful. So he can work miracles, he can manipulate people's minds, he can perform extraordinary public signs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he has a desire to basically deceive us about the fundamental nature of the world. Well, that's basically just like a Cartesian skeptical scenario. And so for the same reasons we resist skepticism, for the same reason I think that Cameron exists, I think that I have a mom, I think 2 + 2 = 4. I think there's like a basic aptitude that my mind has to discover the truth outside of itself, and that the environment that I'm in is friendly to me discovering the truth, and that it's possible for me through diligent rational investigation to get closer to truth. I have to foreclose almost axiomatically that I'm in such a skeptical scenario, where there are these super powerful beings that are completely unrestrained and that are trying to deceive us about the fundamental nature of reality. So that first type of response is like a transcendental response, right? Reasoning from basically this violates the preconditions for knowledge about anything to posit the existence of such a being. Then the second type of response will just be like a more abductive type of response, where I'm just going to say inference to best explanation. So there's a miracle record that appears to uniquely privilege these claims. A really logical explanation for that is that the being that's posited by the Christian worldview, which is itself kind of like a sublime, internally coherent, somewhat antecedently plausible worldview, makes this prediction that this being is going to try to communicate with us and reveal itself to us. And that prediction is also going to be that basically, therefore, the true religion is going to be uniquely privileged by the distribution of miracle evidence that it creates. And then there's a super ad hoc theory, which is like, no, this being isn't who it claims to be, and just randomly decides to claim to be this thing that it's not, and then perform a bunch of miracles. And then it turns out there are no similar beings that are like counteracting it with similarly credible miracles for other false claims. But just for some reason, specifically, the Christian guy has decided that he's motivated to lie about being the Christian God, and is the only one that actually has taken an interest in actually producing false, misleading miracles. So that just violates every principle of good reasoning about how to compare two theories for plausibility that like we subscribe to in every other context. So you might as well be positing like there's a spirit that goes around fooling us at the Large Hadron Collider to create a misleading impression that the standard model of particle physics is true, or that prefers to create a mass illusion that rain happens, or always makes it to where thermometers are off by 1 degree. Like you can posit a bunch of ridiculous ad hoc, not independently motivated theories when there's a very straightforward, natural, intuitively plausible theory to explain the same data, to be a skeptic about anything. But it's just terrible reasoning.
All right, let's move on to our next one, Dave Johnson. He says, if you're interested, a former Mormon turned Catholic named Isaac Hess has responded to Alex on his Substack. Yeah, I actually met Isaac Hess not too long ago at the Trent Horn Conference.
No, yeah, cool. Yeah, everybody should check it out.
All right, Druggan says, have you read Gregory Dawes' Theism and Explanation? It's a methodological argument against theistic explanations. You should do a video on it.
Yeah, people have brought this up to me. I haven't read that book in full, but I'm aware of it.
All right, and then another one from Druggan. Have you looked into the rainbow body phenomena?
Yeah. And so I think a lot of the evidence for this is not very credible. But even if it was...
Tell me what it is. Tell me what it is first.
Yeah, so it's something that tends to happen in a lot of like Eastern mystical contexts, like especially like Buddhist contexts, when it's like we're talking about the bodies of monks and stuff. And so we're talking about, in many cases, like for instance, the person will be deceased, but then there'll be reports by witnesses that the body turned all these colors or started to become illuminated or appeared to disappear, after. So like there's actually a diversity to this phenomenon. But there are people, like there's a Catholic priest that actually spent some time investigating it and deemed it somewhat credible. But I mean, Lydia McGrew actually has a few videos responding to this and going through the limitations of the evidence supporting the phenomena that I would recommend to people to look into if they want to know more. It's not an area where I've focused on or specialized in. But in addition to that, you also just need to keep in mind these aren't miracles. Because for it to be a miracle, it would actually need to purport to be from a supernatural agent, that was performing the sign. So even if you have people who levitate or who are psychics, or who can do magic or who can find buried treasure in seer stones or all this stuff, even if people can do that, it's not necessarily a miracle just because it's paranormal, right? So even if it turns out that the laws of nature are different than we thought, or it turns out that there are certain psychic phenomena that are possible that you thought weren't possible, it could be that those are demonic. So a lot of Catholic tradition will attribute those to the basically efficacy of demons, and they try to create ontological confusion and do all these things, right? And oftentimes, so that's a possibility. Another possibility is just, oh no, there's veracity to these phenomena, but it's not religious, right? Because it's compatible with every religion. Just like if it turns out humans can jump 20 feet in the air, right? Rather than just jumping a few feet in the air, that doesn't prove anybody's religion, right? And if it turns out that only a few humans have that super ability, they're like the X-Men or whatever, that doesn't prove any religion. It's just weird. So it's not actually a miracle.
All right. Next one from John LJSM. Really awesome analysis. Thanks. Yeah, glad that you guys are appreciating it. We've gone through all the clips that I wanted to get through in the interview, so the remainder of the episode will be addressing super chats. Can Ethan do a video discussing just epistemology of miracles? What counts as a miracle? Why is it not God of the gaps? How does he address Dawes?
Sorry, so I'm willing to do. So I'm planning on actually potentially writing a post in the near future about fundamental theology. So basically the possibility and the discernibility of true divine deeds and miracles, and the distinction between just ordinary miracles and vindicatory miracles, and the epistemology that I use to determine that a miracle has occurred, and then what implications can be drawn from it. So probably you should look towards my Substack for an even more in-depth treatment of this in the future. Since we've done a bunch from you, I think I will be a little bit quicker in answering this part about why is it not God of the gaps, and I'm just going to punt on talking about a full book, addressing a full book of objections. But so why is it not God of the gaps? Well, because I'm not saying that because we don't know how to explain the behavior of this particle, in the Large Hadron Collider, that therefore the explanation must be that that was a miracle, right? So that would be saying, oh, look, we don't have a naturalistic explanation for this phenomenon, so therefore we must infer that it is actually a divine being that is interceding to cause this phenomenon. That would be more of a God of the gap style reasoning, which is just inferring from naturalistic inexplicability to a divine or supernatural explanation. And so this is more like basically this stereotypes people say about like ancient mythologies, right? Where it's like, oh, we look at natural phenomena like lightning, right? Or the flowing of water in the river. And then we invent sort of convoluted supernatural explanations that are sort of origin myths for how that happens or why that happens. So it's like whenever Zeus is angry, he throws a lightning bolt or whatever. And so that explains why lightning happens, right? So that would be a God of the gaps explanation. Meanwhile, there are types of phenomena that occur where intuitively they present themselves to us as actions by agents that have certain motivations and that seem to exceed the powers of nature, at least that's in the ordinary course of human experience, right? So it's not just that we don't know a naturalistic explanation for why this phenomena has occurred, but there's something about the nature of the phenomena that suggests to us or recommends to us an intelligent cause that is acting with a religious motivation, right? So for instance, in the Marian apparition context, if Our Lady is appearing to people and communicating and having dialogue with semantic content where she's saying things like, hello, I am Mary, the person that's talked about in Christian revelation. It is me, it is I. I'm predicting all of these objective phenomena that are going to occur, and I'm going to perform all these healings. And then the objective phenomena occur, exceed the power of nature, healings
I was
occur.
also going to suggest Padre Pio Stigmata. Seems to be pretty
I'm just taking an individual case, because all of them satisfy this when I posit a miracle, is there needs to be something positive about the case that recommends to us the action of an intelligent agent who is supernatural. And so, for instance, the fact that the agent itself is identifying itself as supernatural, is having coherent dialogue, which is something that only intelligent causes do, appears to be behaving purposefully, and seems to be orchestrating actions in the way that intelligences always do, that recommends to us, oh, there's an intelligent cause that's not constrained by the powers of nature, and that either wants to deceive us or really is who it says it is. And if it wants to deceive us, see all my previous answers to that previous response. The previous question that you posed. And if it doesn't want to deceive us, then it's telling the truth. And so then we should take the explanation at face value.
All right, Sky Knight says, what do miracles, apparitions do for vindicating a faith tradition as opposed to historical interpretation of councils and church fathers?
Yeah, well, so this is the distinction between fundamental theology and positive theology, right? So fundamental theology concerns revelation in general and revelation as revelation, and then how do you recognize when revelation has occurred, right? And then positive theology is once we've accepted that a revelation has occurred, what's reason within the sources of revelation that we accept to what conclusions we can infer or will follow from the revelation. So miracles are very important within fundamental theology. So the miracles tell us what system of authority God wants us to be a part of and to submit to, right? Meanwhile, councils and church fathers are more important for positive theology. So once we accept a system that has certain rules, it has its own religious epistemology, right, for how we tell what God has said, then we need to just apply those rules to figure out what's true. So when we're deciding between different faith traditions, if we have two different faith traditions that have different authority claims, then the most proper thing to do is not to rely on our ability to do positive theology and then say, oh, well, there's a devastating internal critique of this system within positive theology versus there isn't for this one, so therefore that system is more credible, right? That's like a type of objection that you can advance. But it's not the most proper way to do deciding between competing faith traditions, because all of us are going to recognize that sometimes within whatever system we accept, there are going to be objections that we don't know how to reason through or to work around or to deal with. And these things are just inherently very hard and speculative, and they exceed the intelligence of lots of ordinary people who also have to decide which religion is the true one. So instead, what we want is actually when we're competing between different authority claims, we want to look to sort of external motives rather than just trying to do theology and then use theology to decide who's right. And so that's the same way, like, I don't go and decide that every single claim Jesus makes about the Old Testament is true before I submit to Jesus. Rather, I say, because he resurrected himself from the dead, because he performed all these miracles, because he was prophesied, because he has all these motives of credibility, I submit to Jesus' teaching. So even if I don't understand it, I'll seek out an understanding, but I accept it. I'm docile to it. And that's the attitude we want to have towards the authority system. So for instance, the church. And so when the Catholic Church makes a claim about the Pope and an authority system that puts the Pope as this sort of foundational level for theology and for theological reasoning, then what we really want to look to are what are the motives for accepting that authority claim. And so among those are miracles. And so that is something we really want to do. Now, meanwhile, once we're Catholic, we also want to know what Catholic doctrine is. And so that's when we start doing positive theology and we start going to councils and church fathers, etc. But I do think it's a fundamental mistake that people make when oftentimes they make their like exegesis of like the Acts of Nicaea II as the basis for why I'm Orthodox versus why I'm Catholic versus why I'm Protestant, rather than the really foundational claims.
All right, next one from BB. What are your thoughts on how Joseph Smith couldn't make up his mind and how many gods there were?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's a huge problem for Mormons, which is that Joseph Smith's theology, his doctrine of God, radically evolves over his lifetime. So, like, if you start looking at the Joseph Smith of the Book of Mormon, it seems like he's teaching, like, modalism, but he's also affirming classical theism, so, like, that God is eternal and he's immutable and all of these aspects of God. And it's just a very conventional Protestant attitude. And so then he's having Jesus Christ say things like, in the Book of Ether, I am the Father, I am Jesus Christ, I am the Father and the Son, right? So collapsing the personal distinctions between them. Then by the time you start getting to his lectures on faith that are occurring in the mid-1830s, that's when you start to get sort of weirder and weirder theology where we're denying that the Holy Spirit is a person and we're going further. But then by the time of the King Follett discourse, he's basically like, God was once a man just like you or I, and he's been exalted, and there's this infinite regress of gods. And so you can see this, and I think that it has resulted in a situation where there are just irreconcilable theological contradictions within basically canonized Mormon scripture. And I think it's completely discrediting to Joseph Smith.
When was the King Follett discourse? What was the date?
Oh, here, I'll check the exact date. It's later in his life, but here, it's 1844. So it's 3 months before he died.
Wow. I didn't know it was that late. All right, Catholic s'mores. Ethan, are you going to grow a beard?
No, probably not, but I'm just lazy about shaving.
Thoughts on how Mormonism puts salvation within creation and thus creates a contradiction because everything is at the mercy of heat death?
I don't know about that point, just because within the Mormon system, like obviously God can solve any problems that would arise through just the efficacy of his supernatural power.
All right, next one. God bless Ethan and Cameron. I was wondering if Alexander Proust would ever make an appearance on Capturing Catholicism. It would be a great idea. Yeah, that would be great. I know he doesn't do a ton of those, so there might be a way to convince him to do that, but I will keep it in mind. We might be able to do like a recorded episode with him and then publish an interview or something along those lines. It's possible. I have connections with him. So yeah, thanks for that. Another one from the same person. It would be a great discussion if we got Josh Rasmussen and Father James Dominic Rooney to discuss universalism. Rooney wrote a great book on this. Yes, no, I've actually had Rooney on Capturing Christianity a couple years ago, so you can go check out that interview. I even invited him to come back on the show in a little bit after the July 1st decision on whether or not the SXPX is going to, what's the term? They want to
Consecrate
get some
bishops.
consecrate bishops. So I'll probably be doing an interview with him in July sometime on that topic. So he will make another appearance, but yeah, that's a good suggestion. Isaac of Nineveh, lesser spirits capable of producing all verified Catholic miracles, implying a skeptical scenario, is a non sequitur, like jumping from CIA to world government.
I mean, it's just not true. I mean, if it turns out that there's spirits out there who can go around and have control over people's minds to where they can insert whatever experiences they want into people's minds, and they can do this for huge crowds of people all over the world at all times, and there's nothing that's reining them in or constraining them, and they have the ability to like suspend the laws of nature and do stuff like that. Like, it's just completely unreasonable to assume that there are ad hoc limits on them that prevent them from causing broader skeptical concerns, right? So like, just like, if you told me that there were like lizard men who had taken over the government and who wanted to deceive us about whether the earth was flat or whatever, that would kind of lead to global skepticism about everything. Because like, what if there are lizard men who have the power to pull out elaborate conspiracies and who are deceiving us about like the fundamental nature of reality? Like, why trust anything at that point, you know? And so that's my point. That's the simple point I'm making. So it's not a non sequitur. It's just like a very reasonable common sense inference, which is if there are extremely powerful guys who are not being limited or restrained in deceiving people, who can go around and who can like control people's brains and suspend the laws of nature, and who apparently have an interest in like repeatedly deceiving large numbers of people across time and space. Yeah, that's a huge skeptical problem.
All right, Randoms says Mormon leaders took a hard line on apostasy, like Parish Potter unaliving for leaving the church. Many opposed Young. It's fair to ask if later transfiguration stories helped strengthen loyalty.
I mean, obviously, there was a huge incentive to embellish these stories, which is part of the reason they got embellished.
All right, Vivi Correa says, what would you say to the Seventh-day Adventists who claim that Catholics are the beast in the book of Daniel and our miracles are from Satan and proof that we have the mark of the beast?
Well, I would say, first of all, I would just want to sit down with that person and say, let's first look at criteria from the Bible that both of us accept for how to tell the difference between when a miracle is from Satan versus when a miracle is from God, and when people can be expected to recognize that something is from Satan, even if they have certain theological difficulties. And we can work out how to consistently apply that. And we can also just reason about it from first principles too. And I think whenever they try to do that, they're going to realize that basically they're going to be led to have a very unbiblical epistemology if they're going to actually try to dismiss all of these Catholic miracles as demonic. I think another problem that they're going to have is just that we can debate with them about the inspired sanctity of the Catholic Church and of all of many of its members and all of the saints that it's producing, and the sublimity of the Catholic Church's doctrine and all of this. And so we can also take that head on to just the intrinsic plausibility of this.
All right, we'll get through these last remaining super chats quickly. If a revelatory experience satisfies the fruits test and is supernatural but violates explicit dogmas like the Trinity, what would that imply?
Well, if something satisfies all the criteria for discernment, right? So basically, it would be a vindicatory miracle that there would be sufficient positive motives to conclude that it was from God, and there would be the absence of any negative signs that were not circular that we could use to exclude it as being demonic. So basically, you had enough positive evidence and you were missing all the negative evidence you could use to disqualify it. but then it contradicted past revelation, then it would just like falsify our worldview, you know? So it would refute us in the same way. It's like asking a question like, if the Pope spoke ex cathedra and then declared that Jesus Christ wasn't God, what would that mean for Catholicism? It would just falsify us. So we think God can't lie, which means that if there is a true miracle where God is affirming something and it satisfies all the criteria that God has promised to us, then it has to be consistent with what came in the past, right? And we can infer that if we perceive a contradiction, then the error is with us, right? Rather than within God and the body of doctrine that he's affirming. Now, if it turns out that that assumption can't be maintained, then that just falsifies my worldview. I need to get a new worldview, you know, just in the same way that if I can't affirm that ecumenical councils are infallible because they contradict each other, I need a new worldview, you know.
Ethan, what are the best sources to study Marian apparitions?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're interested in. Because, like, so if you're interested in fundamental theology, so like reasoning about it from first principles, then go to Garrigou-Lagrange and Scheeben and all these people who are like Catholic authors that have written on that subject. And, you know, like the STS and all of these other manuals and handbooks you can get that will discuss these issues. If you want to study particular Marian apparitions, you know, like if you want to focus on like Fatima, or like Fatima's one that I've done a lot of work on, you could go read the articles on my Substack, and I have bibliographies. And there's like The Whole Truth About Fatima is a very good comprehensive work that covers a broad range of topics relating to the Fatima apparitions. You know, if you want to do Guadalupe, like there's different sources that I'm going to recommend. So yeah, I mean, it's a kind of broad question, but Capturing Catholicism has a lot of great content. Go to my blog too, and I tend to recommend the stuff I think people should read.
Could you do a video on Alistair McIntyre's moral arguments? Possibly. Although, yeah, if I did a video on that, on like a moral argument, it would be probably hosted on the main channel, but that's not really my area of focus right now. So, all right, last two. Please say a prayer for my boss. His wife is sick, not sure on specifics, but he's taken time off and he is notorious for not doing this. I'm going to say a Hail Mary for Parker Manning's boss right now. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. All right. Tough situation. And everyone else that is watching, please say a prayer. Marple says, Cameron and Ethan, do you guys like to study scholastic theology? What are the best ways to get into it since it is hard to understand and complicated? I guess I'll just answer really quickly. Do I like to study scholastic theology? No, I do not, for basically the reasons that you've outlined here. I didn't get my understanding of philosophy and theology from scholastic metaphysics or the scholastic fathers, so to speak. I gained them from the analytic tradition, and it's basically like learning a new language when I'm reading these Thomistic sources. So I don't really like to do it, but I think I need to broaden my understanding of, like, because the Catholic Church is like entrenched in this language. So it would be really wise, I think, for any Catholic to at least be open to studying those sources.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm a philosophy student, so like I'm into that, and I like complex, abstruse stuff. But if you don't have that background, or you don't have the same interest in it, but you're interested in getting started with it, like a guy I would really strongly recommend to you is just Ed Feser and reading his books. So like he has one that's really good for a lay audience. That's like 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. If you want to go a bit deeper with him, he has a book called Scholastic Metaphysics, Immortal Souls. Those are like, I've found him to be really good for people who want to bridge between, maybe they have a little bit more experience with like analytic philosophy in the past and like modern philosophers and how they talk and how they think, and they kind of want to get into the way of thinking of scholastics. He's generally been like a really great bridge. And there are other people that are good in this regard too, but Feser's just one where I also just really like his writing style.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I've read some of Feser's stuff. He's been on the channel before too. We did have one last one that was sent in. Does Ethan have a YouTube channel?
Not right now.
Yes, not right now. All right, let's wrap things up. Yeah, so did we get a sort of debunking of Marian apparitions, Ethan?
No, I mean, unfortunately, in debating supernatural apparitions with Alex O'Connor, the title of the video, we had a question posed about supernatural apparitions, but we had a response that was about basically everything else. So like the transphysicality of Jesus's resurrected body and like the transfiguration of Brigham Young and all of this stuff, but nothing that actually, tied it to the core question, which is what does Alex O'Connor make of the evidence for Fatima and Zeitoun and for all of these supernatural phenomena in the modern day? And that to me seems like a very crucial question that I look forward to seeing him actually address in the future.
So also, if Alex just happens to be watching this and you've watched it all until this point, I would like to formally invite you to have a discussion or a debate with Ethan on this topic or on another topic that you guys can mutually agree on. I'm sure that Ethan would be open to that at some point in the future. I've even sent an email to Alex inviting him to do such a discussion, either hosting it here or elsewhere. It doesn't matter to me. I just would love to see these two guys in a conversation. So Alex, if you're open to that, just shoot me a message. You know the ways that I'm available. So, all right, man, this has been great. I really appreciate you spending some time with me and the Capturing Catholicism audience. So
thank you so much. Again. It's been great.